support, and everybody sees that they need support. Mozambique requested Rwanda to work with them, support them in fighting the religious radical insurgency that was happening in one province called Cabo Delgado, which is 3 times the size of my country, geographically. So we went there because they requested, and we've been doing a good job with our friends and partners in Mozambique. Mozambique also accepted others to come and help. That's a different issue. I will not talk about that. I'll talk about what concerns Rwanda. The place we deployed in, which is in that part of Cabo Delgado, which was mainly affected, we resolved the problem over the last 2 years and some months, maybe 80% or 85% of that, working with the locals, working with the Mozambicans. Having really 2 tasks. One was to actually deliver security using our own, even if you would say limited capacity, but it is effective on the ground. And working together with the Mozambicans, we were able to do that. And if you look at the cost of it, it's a very, small cost if compared to what has been with other peacekeeping operations that have been going on now. But even then, you can see that, as we were saying, lessons that are not learned even with time. The international community, which sometimes expresses support for Mozambique and this and that, do very little, in fact, to support this kind of thing, this model where Africans are getting together, working together to deliver the security that is required in different parts of the country. That is, whether we are talking about Mozambique or Central African Republic. I mean, you ask yourself, if what is needed, what people want is just the final product of delivering security, stability, so that, and in fact, these countries are countries with huge resources, and some of them have attracted investments from these developed countries. Instead of supporting that, they are not doing so. Well, they know if they even bring their model to work in there, bringing UN peacekeepers and so on and so forth. Well, they haven't done it, but even if they brought it, maybe it would be similar to what is happening in the DRC. So you wonder then, and this question keeps coming up anyway in everything, whether we learn lessons. And therefore, I don't think we do, because if we did, then we would be seeing what works actually working. But you find what works is not even encouraged to work. It is even undermined. In fact, some questions being asked in Mozambique, you see, but Rwanda in Mozambique, but they are also in Congo. And therefore, that stops. They think by not helping this operation in which Rwanda is heavily involved, they are punishing Rwanda. I don't know for what.
Right.
But actually, they are punishing Mozambique, not Rwanda, because that's where the problem is. So I don't understand the logic. I don't understand what.
So let me ask you a question about what you see as blind spots of the West when it thinks about security in Africa. So, when I think about it, you mentioned the DRC, and recently, I think about a week ago, our State Department said to your government and to you, you need to punish part of your own forces, which the United States assert cooperated with M23 in some attacks inside the DRC. And I don't want to get into a discussion of who did what to whom. Your government has denied that. I'm more interested in the question of what is the Paul Kagame plan if you were to talk to Blinken and to Sullivan, which I know you have done, say this is how, from your perspective, this needs to be fixed. But I'm interested in a more broad question as well. We've seen a lot of coups, Niger, Guinea, various places, in the region, and you've just recently traveled to some of these countries just in the past week. What are we getting wrong in understanding stability in Africa that you think the United States and Europe can, significantly improve on?
Well, to begin with, what I would do if I would be talking to these leaders in those countries, like United States and others, I would start by telling them that they can do much, much better than that. Because in the end, they are really doing nothing. Passing statements of condemnation and blaming this or that without addressing the problem, I think simply adds to the problem, not doesn't address it. So that's what I would start with telling them. And for every problem, there is a root cause. You simply look at the root cause of the problem and what the problem is, and work with the parties involved to address what needs to be addressed, in your sense, and reduce on the politics, on the interest, on this, on that. I mean, some of these things, they just don't go away unless you do what is necessary to be done that underlies the problem. I mean, it doesn't need a lot of capacity to think or what. What all of us have can serve us to understand the issues like this. So that's what I would tell them. Now, if you extend it across the continent, the main failure on our continent and these other places where there is a failure of governance and security, both of them which are needed for any society to stabilize and function the way it should and the way the people would wish to see happen. So if you look at countries where coup d'etats have been happening, nobody wishes to see coup d'etats happen in any place. There's nothing to celebrate about that. But at the same time, you don't stop there. You just don't condemn coups without even trying to find out, basically, what is it that led to this point? What was it that was lacking for a coup to happen? This is when you start seeing signs of that in governance or lack of security, as we have seen mainly in some of these countries in West Africa. I mean, these are things that anyone can see. You don't need to dig deep to investigate. You can see it. In fact, you can see it before it has happened, and you can tell that something is going to happen in this place or the other. So why can't people, first on our own continent, the Africans ourselves, in fact, which, again, we have talked about that, the way within Africa, Africans can work together to address a problem like we did in Mozambique or in Central African Republic. But with even developed countries, support or involvement the right way, it would happen faster and more easily. So why doesn't it happen? They all concentrate now on condemning. By the way, it is funny, it is in fact ridiculous, because in some cases, they would condemn people in certain places where coups have happened and be quiet in similar cases.
Right.
Like you see, even the failure of governance, they attack, countries, lack of democracy, lack of freedom, lack of human rights, lack of this. And where some of these are lacking the most, but because of the interests that people have in those countries, it will be muted. Effectively, nothing to be talked about that. So are we really addressing the problems the way they should be addressed, or we are just posturing and talking about, need for this and giving lectures and
right?
So on and so
Let me try to squeeze in a couple of more quick questions before we go. One big one, I think, is, in our past discussions, I remember talking to you when you visited Washington for the US-Africa Leaders Summit. And at that time, you were beginning to think, about the broader US-Rwanda relationship. That relationship had some barriers in it, including Paul Rusesabagina being in prison, your justice system commuted his sentence. A lot of progress has been made on the stumbling blocks in between Rwanda and the United States. But at the time when you were in Washington, you said, Washington kind of goes up and down. It has attention and then it disappears. And you said it's very inconsistent. I'm interested in whether there's now a consistency of attention in the relationship between the Biden White House and the Biden State Department, over the importance of relations with you and Rwanda, or whether it is something that goes to sleep for a while and then awakens when there's a crisis or a problem. What is what's the terrain of that relationship?
I think you can take my previous statement when you were in Washington. It hasn't changed much. And when I answered that question, I was also conscious that things don't change so easily anyway in some cases. And with this one, it wasn't going to change. But, and for example, Rusesabagina should not have been a case to quarrel about between the United States and Rwanda anyway, to begin with.
Right.
But and we dealt with it because it was there to be dealt with. And we tried to do it the best way we could. We got it out of the way.
But even getting beyond that, you're not having, nirvana in US-Rwanda relations, is what I'm hearing.
No
nirvana. Well, let me just ask you really. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
You are going to sleep and waking up. This time there hasn't been waking up. It has been.
I'm sure that's going to be tweeted somewhere. And look, the other controversial thing you and I have discussed before is the UK's Illegal Migration Act. Rwanda hosts and brings into Rwanda as part of a relationship with the UK. Asylum seekers come in, and Rwanda has been designated as a safe place and harbor by UK courts. And, that's controversial with a lot of people. It's controversial in some, with a judge in Northern Ireland, et cetera. You and I have talked about the environment, the jobs, et cetera, that you're trying to do for these employees. What's interesting to me is that a poll inside the EU has recently said that more than half of EU member states want the same deal with Rwanda, would like to have that kind of relationship. And, it's a complicated subject because asylum and dealing with people that are running away from whatever trauma or circumstance in their life there. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And the fact is that despite the controversy that some attach to this practice of moving folks to Rwanda, which I imagine is both economic development, but it's something you're thinking about with regards to population growth. But the fact that a lot of other nations in the EU want it, what are your thoughts about that? Do you want to expand the program?
Yeah, putting the controversy aside, we in Rwanda, we insist on trying to do things the best way we can. And there will be people who criticize, there are others who will appreciate what it is for the fact of it. So we chose to be consistent in our way of trying to do things. One, the fact that There have been debates about whether Rwanda is safe, but in the end, it is what it is. You know it, Steve. UK knows it, Europe knows it, US knows it. Rwanda is actually safe. So being safe does not depend on whether somebody likes us or not. It is a good we have provided to ourselves and to our country, and it exists. So let's put it aside. The other thing, what is lacking is the level of development that takes care of our people the way we want, or that would take care of other people who come here, whether they are migrants or whatever, and wherever they come from, to also be taken care of the way they want or we want. That's another thing on the side. So the issue of migration and how we dealt with it started way beyond UK. In fact, even now, today, we are processing migrants who were stuck in Libya, who were trying to cross into Europe and got stuck there, or others were dying in the Mediterranean. And we provided that safe haven for people to come here or be processed through here to wherever they wanted to go in 2018. It's not a recent thing. And that time, we had no agreement with anyone, so there wasn't even anyone going to pay for it except ourselves. The people worked for these migration institutions, international institutions, or UNHCR, and so on and so forth. So since 2018, hundreds of thousands of people have been brought by air from Libya to Rwanda. This is what UK, I think, noticed, that there was another way of dealing with this problem, which had turned into a huge problem for them, as it is for the whole of Europe. So they asked us if that could be expanded to deal with such a problem as they have it. And we accepted, because we have had a good relationship before with the UK. In terms of our development, they have been supporting our development for many years, and so on and so forth. So our people discussed, but then we had to discuss it. How do we do it the best way so that we don't cause any injury to anybody in the process, but solve the problem for United States, for UK, for migrants, and for ourselves. So UK provided, because we told them, for example, that we cannot bring people here because of our limited means. We're not going to be able to look after them effectively as you've been looking after them in your own country, except now for relocation. So that's how this development component on this part of the agreement came about. But anyway, support for our development was going on even before. Doing this. So now we are looking at the debates that are going on in the UK or in Europe or wherever about whether Rwanda is safe. For us, it is immaterial. We understand who we are, we know what we have here, we know we can provide the security to anyone, governance, and so what we lack is different. It is the means to apply to it for development of these people. So when people are there debating, is Rwanda safe, is it that, well, that becomes politics.
Well, it's very popular with a lot of other EU states. Look, I'm getting the signal that we need to bring this to conclusion. I can talk, as you know, for hours with you on these issues, and really grateful for your time. I want to talk about sports and what you've done with sports as economic development and your sports diplomacy in Guinea and Senegal. There are a lot of things that we've got to leave for the next discussion we have, but I really want to thank you for joining the Global Security Forum. I'm excited to see the airport in 2027, and I want to go to a future gorilla naming ceremony, and I'll leave to the audience to figure all that out. But Paul Kagame, thank you so much. Great to be with you again.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. I want to introduce Jean-Paul Nirubatama, stand up, Jean-Paul. This is the President's Special Advisor, Deputy Head of Intelligence, and I think you can now relax. So I want to thank you, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. And I just want to say, it's a real pleasure to interview the President. I did this a few years ago live, and they told me, the President's team told me when we did do a live interview, he was still in Kigali, but we were here. He says, when the President wants to stop talking or end the conference with you, as he often does, particularly with Western journalists, his face will scrunch up and his answers will get really, really short. And I've learned that in our discussions, that never happens. He could literally go on for hours with us, and so he does send his regards to everybody. Thank you very much.
Votre micro. Voilà, parfait. A very good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Global Security Forum. Your Excellency, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us in Doha. We meet, of course, at a time of heightened tensions in this region, a sensitive time in this region, and I'd just like to address briefly, if we can, the Gaza conflict with you, because the African Union has been unequivocal in its condemnation of attacks of civilians in the Gaza Strip. You've called on the international community and major world powers to assume their responsibilities, in your own words, to urgently impose peace and guarantee the rights of Palestinians. How do we do that? And do you still have faith in this rules-based order?
Thank you very much. Thank you for receiving me fully. Our support and solidarity with Palestinian people is not new. As you know, Africa has been colonized, and we know more than everybody what means a colonial regime and an apartheid system. About what is going on in Gaza. From the beginning, from the first instance, we condemn in a very stronger terms what this devastating war is causing to Palestinian people. More than 35,000 people lost their lives. And the majority is children and women. It's not acceptable.
So how do we end then? How?
We should.
How?
I think the international community, particularly the big powers, precisely United States, have to act. They have to act. It is a shame for our humanity, watching every day people, children, women killed, and I think it causes a real problem of credibility of the international community, of multilateralism, of international law, of humanitarian international law. I think it is morally unacceptable.
Yeah. On this question of credibility, Your Excellency, we're seeing a consolidation of the global south when it comes to this crisis. The International Criminal Court, which has often been accused of focusing too much on Africa, perhaps is going to be requesting an arrest warrant for leaders of Hamas and Israel. We've also seen the case of genocide brought by South Africa at the International Court of Justice, which is supported by the African Union in a number of African countries, the most significant one recently being South Africa. Do you still think, though, that international law can prevail in this conflict? And how does the African Union, an institution like the African Union, play a role in redefining this global order that you say is lacking credibility today?
I think we have to deal with what is now what we call the international law. That's why I think the courts, the justice, the international justice should take its responsibility. The United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, has to take his responsibility. As African, as Global South, I think people realize that there is double standards. And this is a real threat to our current system. So we have to revise it. At least we have to implement what we commonly decided for decades. So that's why I'm talking about credibility of the whole system. If you still continue to use double standard, I think a life of a Palestinian, of an Israeli, of an African is the same.
Right.
So we should respect this minimum. I think it is our right to tell our international community, our current institutions, to just apply what we decided, what we call the international legality. We have to implement it first. And I think this is a period that should push us to revise and to take the appropriate disposition for peace, stability, justice, equality between human beings.
Okay, one last question before we move on, because there's of course a great deal to discuss when it comes to the African continent. One last question on this issue. Israel has worked for years to develop relations with African countries. It was granted observer status in 2021 at the African Union, which has been suspended now. Is there a future still, you think, in relations between Israel and the African continent?
I think it depends at least for Israel to observe and to respect the international law and to respect the rights, the legitimate rights of Palestinian people. It is simple as this.
Okay, Your Excellency, thank you for that. Yeah. The African Union Peace and Security Council is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And this offers, of course, a moment of reflection on the recent progress and ongoing challenges. President Kagame addressed this in his intervention a short while ago. We are seeing for the first time in history 6 African countries suspended from the African Union after they experienced military takeovers. Coups are at their highest points on the continent. As recently as 2 days ago, there was an alleged attempted coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There is now a coup belt, what's described as a coup belt on the continent from east to west. How do you reflect on these unconstitutional changes on the African continent? Has democracy failed our continent?
This phenomenon is a real challenge for African Union, for the African continent. As you said, for the first time, there is 6 African countries suspended from African Union because of unconstitutional change. And we're celebrating next weekend the 20th anniversary of our Peace and Security Council. So I think it is this issue of unconstitutional change is the top of our agenda in a few days. And we have to evaluate. To evaluate, there is a risk for the credibility of our peace and security architecture, because 20 years ago, we set this instrument, which is Peace and Security Council. And this phenomenon of unconstitutional change, you can add also the lack of solidarity. Mm-hmm. That's why I appreciate what has been said by President Kagame. When he discussed with President Nyusi of Mozambique and decided to send Rwandan troops to Mozambique, they consulted me, both of them. And I strongly supported this, because this is a proof of solidarity between African countries. Mm-hmm. There is a lack. For example, in the fight against terrorism, if you see 3 or 4 of Sahel states, when there is coup d'etat, all these countries are facing terrorist attacks. And the explanation, the reason of the military is that there is a security challenge, right, and the civilians, president, are not able to deal with it. So we decided as army to take the power and to protect our nation.
Because some of these unconstitutional changes have enjoyed popular support in some of these countries,
Absolutely.
whether it's Burkina Faso
Absolutely.
or Mali. So how do you reconcile that?
I think that's why I think the 20th anniversary is an opportunity for the member of Peace and Security Council, and even for the whole member of the African Union, to evaluate. Should we suspend every country where there is a coup? What kind of coup?
Are all coups
So
a bad thing?
I think, and even President Kagame said it, maybe with nuance, we don't apply the same rules to all the cases. So if you make exception, it is very dangerous. It could create a precedent, a jurisprudence. So I think we need to be in conformity with our reality, not having text norms, and the reality is different. So we have to coordinate and to be in phase with this step in the history of our continent. I think it is very, very important.
So what's your advice then to African governments who want to reduce the chances of a coup in their countries? Who want to reduce the chances of a coup in their country? What is your advice to them to avoid these unconstitutional changes?
The issue is a governance issue. It is essentially a governance issue. It is about justice. It was about equity between the population of a country. So I think it is not with norms at the level of the regional or the continental institution that we can resolve it. I think fundamentally it is an issue of governance. You have to improve governance. When people will be in phase and agree with the kind of governance in their country, I think we can reduce this kind of unconstitutional change in the countries.
The theme for this forum, Your Excellency, is strategic partnership. And you have today Russia, for example, offering itself as a partner to some of the coup leaders on the continent. It seems that Africa has become the stage for a battle of influence among major powers, which we heard about in the previous session, China, Russia, the US. How do we avoid turning Africa into a geostrategic battleground for these global powers? What efforts needs to happen to strengthen Africa's geopolitical effectiveness and also its unity? How do we avoid turning it into a battleground for global powers?
I think when we transform OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to African Union,
right,
is in order to unite the continent and to speak with one voice, particularly in the international arena. One of our main objective is integration and to talk with one voice. Now we have a lot of partnership with United States, Europe, China, Russia, Turkey, Arab world, we have different kind of partnership. So we have to coordinate it and to give power, real power, to the continental bodies as African Union to talk to the continent to be the spokesperson, a kind of spokesperson to defend the interests of our continent. But I should recognize now we're not united as we want, and sometimes we feel that member states don't follow what has been decided at the level of the continent, and sometimes deal themselves with some countries. So we need a real effort to unite, to speak with one voice in order to strengthen the position of Africa in the international arena.
Right.
It is a real challenge also for us.
On the question of terrorism, which you touched on a bit, if we could focus on it a little bit more. I mean, it's still ravaging the continent. It's happening everywhere in the Sahel region, in the southern region of Africa, in Mozambique, in the Horn of Africa. And there's a substantial increase in both the frequency of these attacks and their lethal nature. The 2023 Global Terrorism Report stated that the Sahel region alone accounted for more deaths from terrorism in 2022 than Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa regions combined. And you talked about unity, and it seems like when it comes to the question of terrorism, each country is basically fending off this threat on its own. And the UN hasn't really been doing much, and each country is dealing with this threat on its own. How do we shift from a reactive response to the question of terrorism to a more preemptive approach on this issue?
I think terrorism is a threat to peace and security in the world. That's why, for more than a decade, it is in the center of our plea for a new doctrine, because we feel that the cases in Africa are not treated normally, particularly by the United Nations, and particularly by the Security Council. We feel that there is an international solidarity in other parts of the world, but in Africa, we let Africans alone to fight against terrorism. We, for more than decades, were fighting how to finance our own mission against terrorism. You remember in the Sahel, the states organized themselves and created the G5 Sahel force, for example. But we didn't have any support from the Security Council. Recently, I think at the end of last year, there is a new resolution to finance 75% of the African peace mission. I think
which came after a long time, after 15 years of debate on this issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a progress. But I think more should be done to be able to. Unfortunately, different regions in the continent are contaminated.
Right.
Libya, the whole Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, in the Horn of Africa, and even in the south, in Mozambique, and in the Great Lake region, even in DRC. So I think we need a new way to finance the fight against terrorism. And the international community, I think it is absolutely legitimate for us to ask for the United Nations and others to support us to face this terrible phenomenon.
This Security Council move agreeing to fund African Union-led peacekeeping missions, again, came after a very long time and a lot of debate. How do you see it being a game changer for peace and security efforts on the continent? I
said it is a progress. And we need to complete, because now as I said, different regions are contaminated by terrorist groups. And we have to act immediately. Otherwise, it can expand and even completely destroy some states. As you know, in Africa, our states are young or fragile, so we need more support. And I think for the partners, they should realize that terrorism don't have borders. If the situation in Africa, as in Somalia, for almost 3 decades, so we will have more failed state, and it's very dangerous. Right. So we need a real support to fight against this phenomenon.
Just to focus on one or two of the crises right now that are grabbing headlines around the world, Sudan being one of them. It's been over a year of conflict in Sudan, millions of people displaced, thousands killed. What role are you playing in current negotiations to find a sustainable peace for Sudan?
In Sudan, from the beginning, the African Union Peace and Security Council met just the second day, the 16th of April. And 5 days after, we organized a meeting with the whole international community. The UN Secretary General attended. The 5 permanent members of UN Security Council attended themselves. The neighboring countries and others. We decided to launch an initiative on African Union and IGAD, which is a regional organization, to start negotiating and stop first the war. In the meantime, United States and Saudi Arabia started a process, Jeddah process in Saudi Arabia, when the parties accepted to sign a ceasefire agreement, but it's never respected. So now we're trying with IGAD, with other partners, to organize a political process.
But how? How do you do that? How do you navigate and contend with all these different actors that are involved in this conflict? Yes, especially the external actors also, the UAE being one of them.
This is a problem. In general, in African crisis, there is a lot of external interferences. And it is an element of complication, not facilitation. So that's why we said, we can ask you to help, to support, even to be with us, but let us lead this process. And it is a real challenge. As it is well known that the international and the external interferences complicated things in Africa. It is the case in Sudan, unfortunately.
And so what about the crisis in the Great Lakes region, Rwanda and the DRC? There's a lot of acrimony between those two countries. What role are you playing in that specific crisis?
The African Union asked the president of Angola to mediate between DRC and Angola. As you know, in DRC, there is 2 processes. One is called the Nairobi process. It is dialogue negotiation between DRC government and the armed groups. There is a large number of them in the east of DRC. The second one is Rwanda process, so negotiation between Angola and DRC. And we are supporting both of them. What we ask is there is no solution, military solution in DRC, as in every African conflict. So we need them to accept, to negotiate with Congolese groups. I think accepting the principle to negotiate doesn't mean to accept everything.
Right.
So we advise publicly DRC to negotiate even with M23 because they are Congolese, so they can discuss with them. And as African Union, we are ready to support all processes. So
you don't think the 5,000 SADC force that's going to be sent to the region to replace the East African force is a good idea?
Before these forces, there was an East African Community force. African Union supported even financially this force. Unfortunately, after a few months, DRC refused this force and called for a SADC force. Mm-hmm. I think what is the most important thing is that it is obvious there not will be a military solution. So we need all of partners, all of neighbors, all of African institutions and the international community to help the parties to find a political solution to this kind of crisis.
Your Excellency, there are today millions of young Africans crossing oceans, deserts in search of a better life in Europe. They are climbing the wall now along the US-Mexico border. They are ending up trapped in countries like Tunisia, where they face persecution, risking everything for a chance at a better life. How does that reality today of these millions of young Africans risking it all in search of a better life, how does that reality resonate with you on a personal level?
It is